She came to the edge of the town called Prosperity with nothing but a burlap sack holding a threadbare blanket, a tin cup, and a memory of a voice. The voice belonged to the matron of the orphanage that had finally, at the turning of her 17th year, cast her out into the vast, uncaring geometry of the plains. The strongest shapes, the old woman had once whispered, not to her but to the wind itself, have no corners for the wind to break. The girl carried those words like a compass. Prosperity was a town of corners. Its buildings were rigid squares of fresh-sawn lumber, its streets a merciless grid, its fences drawn in sharp, possessive lines. It was a place built to fight the land, to impose order with right angles and straight demarcations. To the girl, it felt like a cage of sticks laid out under the enormous, curving sky. She walked past its edges, her gaze sweeping over the landscape, until she saw it, a derelict grain silo on a gentle rise, a forgotten circle of rusted metal, a monument to a different kind of thinking. It stood alone, its corrugated sides the color of dried blood, its conical roof a dunce cap against the blue. It was ugly, abandoned, an object of utility left to decay. But it had no corners. A small, orange cat, itself a stray she had gathered to her on the road, wound around her ankles, a tiny spark of warmth against the chill of her solitude. She named him Ember. Here, she thought, looking at the round, imperfect structure. This will be the place. The wind, that constant sculptor of the plains, seemed to agree. It flowed around the silo with a sigh, a caress, not the frustrated shriek it made when it struck the sharp-edged buildings of the town below. She put down her sack, the decision made not with logic but with the deep, cellular certainty of an animal seeking shelter. The silo was a hollow promise, a shell, but it was a promise that curved, that yielded, that understood the nature of the wind. The town of Prosperity, built on the principle of straight lines and clear sight, noticed her immediately. A lone figure on the rise, a girl child adopting a piece of rusted scrap for a home, was an affront to their established order. The talk began in the general store, a low hum of disapproval orchestrated by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose own home was a testament to rectitude, with its sharp gables and crisply painted, perpendicular siding. Living in a tin can, she declared over a bolt of calico, her voice carrying the weight of social decree. Like a field mouse. It's unnatural. It's a disgrace to the decency of this town. Her judgment spread like a contagion, and soon the girl became a living spectacle, a cautionary tale whispered from porch to porch. Children were told not to wander near the silo, as if its circular strangeness might be catching. Sheriff Thorne, a man whose concern was as rigid and unbending as his posture, made the official visit. He stood before the gaping maw of the silo's entrance, his hat in his hands, his face a mask of weary duty. "Child," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind, "this is no place for a person. There's a cot in the church basement. It's dry. It's warm." He gestured back toward the town, toward the safety of the known, the security of 4 square walls. A square wall is a proven wall. This is a folly. The girl, whose name was Rowan, simply shook her head, her gaze steady. "Thank you, Sheriff. But my walls will be here." Her quiet refusal baffled him. It was not defiance, but a serene, unshakable conviction that he could not penetrate. The ridicule then took a sharper form. Finn, a lanky youth whose cruelty was born of boredom, made a game of it. He and his friends would creep near the silo in the twilight hours and hurl stones against its metal skin, the loud, jarring clang echoing across the prairie. Clang! "You're a scrap heap girl." Clang! "Living in a barrel." Clang! Rowan never showed herself, never shouted back. She would simply pause in her work, her hand resting on the cool metal, and wait for the sound to fade, feeling the vibrations not as an attack, but as a reminder of the world she was sealing herself away from. The sound of their square stones on her round wall. Her life became a rhythm of relentless, solitary labor, a testament to the quiet power of focused will. The silo was not a home to be occupied, but a fortress to be forged. First, the walls. They were a sieve of rust and time, pocked with holes that whistled with every breeze. She spent weeks scavenging the dump behind the town, collecting discarded sheets of tin, old barrel hoops, and anything else flat and metallic. With a hammer and cold chisel found in the silo's debris, she cut patches, patiently riveting them over the larger holes. For the smaller fissures, she rendered tallow from the few scraps of fat she could trade for, mixing it with ash and pine pitch to create a thick, black sealant that she smeared into every crack and seam, her hands becoming permanently stained with the work. The wind, once a constant intruder, now only murmured against the outer skin. The floor was packed earth, cold and damp. She turned to the creek a mile away, its bed lined with smooth, flat stones. Day after day, she made the journey, carrying 2 stones at a time in her sack, her back and shoulders screaming in protest. She laid them one by one, fitting their irregular shapes together like a vast, grey mosaic, creating a solid, insulated barrier against the frozen ground beneath. Within this circle of stone and metal, she built her inner world. From the skeletal remains of a collapsed barn, she salvaged weathered timbers, not to build square rooms, but to construct curved shelves that followed the silo's circular contour, creating flowing lines of storage. A small, efficient stove was her masterpiece, crafted from a rusted-out oil drum and a length of scavenged stovepipe that she carefully angled through the conical roof, sealing it with a collar of clay and more of her black tar. This stove became the heart of her home, a crucible of warmth she fed with tireless effort. Firewood was the currency of survival, and she gathered it with a feverish intensity. She did not just collect fallen branches, she learned the trees, identifying the deadfall oak and hickory that would burn slow and hot. She dragged logs twice her size back to the silo, spending hours with a dull saw, her body aching, until she had a mountain of fuel. She stacked it not outside, but inside, lining a full third of the silo's interior wall with a dense, floor-to-ceiling bulwark of split logs, a formidable barricade of stored warmth. Food was a similar obsession. She foraged for wild berries, drying them on screens in the late summer sun. She traded her labor, mending clothes, weeding gardens, for sacks of flour, beans, and salt. With this salt, she cured strips of jerky from a small deer an old trapper had given her a piece of. Her shelves groaned under the weight of her foresight, jars of dried herbs, sacks of grain, tins of salted meat. Ember, her small orange cat, was her silent companion through it all, a flicker of orange against the grey metal, his purr the only sound besides the wind and the whisper of her own breath. He would watch her, his golden eyes reflecting the growing order she was imposing on her circular chaos, a silent, living witness to her magnificent, lonely toil. One afternoon, as the autumn sky began to take on the hard, brittle clarity that precedes the deep cold, she received her only visitor who did not come to mock or to pity. Abel, the old trapper who lived so deep in the hills he was more rumor than man, appeared at the opening of her silo. He was a figure carved from hickory and leather, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the winter horizon. He rarely came to Prosperity, and when he did, he moved through it like a ghost, trading his pelts for salt, powder, and flour before melting back into the wilderness. He did not speak at first. He simply stood there, his gaze taking in not her, but the world around her. He watched a flock of ptarmigans, their feathers already a mottled white, weeks ahead of season. He noted the unusual thickness of the beaver dams in the nearby creek, their mud and stick ramparts built high against a coming flood. His eye scanned the northern horizon, reading a language in the clouds that no one in the town below could decipher. Finally, his gaze settled on her massive, circular stack of firewood inside the silo. He looked at her, then, and his voice was the rasp of dry leaves skittering across stone. "The squirrels have buried their nuts deep this year," he stated, not as a piece of trivia, but as a solemn pronouncement. "The bark on the north side of the aspens is thick as my thumb. The wind is practicing a new song in the pines." A low 1 inch. He paused, his eyes moving over the curved walls of her strange home, seeing not the rust and the poverty, but its essential shape. He understood. "A circle sheds the wind," he said, the words a profound echo of the matron's long-lost wisdom. "A square fights it. And this winter, the wind will be looking for a fight." He gave a single, curt nod, a gesture that contained more approval and validation than all the sermons and pleasantries of the town combined. He turned and walked away without another word, his form disappearing over the rise. Rowan watched him go, a deep sense of peace settling over her. His words were not a prophecy of doom, but an affirmation of her instinct. The world of right angles and rigid certainty below could not see what was coming, for they only looked at each other. Abel, like her, looked at the world itself. The validation from this silent, knowledgeable man was a shield. The stones of ridicule could no longer touch her. The whispers from the town were just meaningless noise. She had been seen, and her choice had been understood by the only person whose opinion was written in the language of the earth itself. She turned back to her work, her purpose now honed to a razor's edge. The change came not gradually, but as if a celestial switch had been thrown. The sky, which had been a crisp, indifferent blue, thickened into a bruised, violet-grey slate in the space of a single afternoon. The air grew heavy, still, and unnaturally warm, a deceptive calm that made the animals nervous. Ember paced the silo's interior, his tail twitching, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Then the temperature dropped, not by degrees, but as if the bottom had fallen out of the world. The first gust of wind was not a prelude, it was an assault. It struck the silo with a physical blow, a solid wall of force that made the metal groan. But it found no corner to grip, no edge to pry. It screamed and tore at the curved walls, its fury deflected, splitting and flowing around the structure like water around a river stone. Then came the snow. It did not drift down in gentle flakes. It drove horizontally, a blinding, scouring wall of white that erased the world. The sky and the earth became one. There was no horizon, no direction, only the deafening howl of the wind and the suffocating presence of the snow. The world went white. Inside her circle, Rowan was calm. The stove, her carefully crafted heart of heat, glowed a steady, reassuring red. The immense wall of firewood she had built not only provided fuel but acted as a massive insulator, its dense bulk absorbing the deep, penetrating cold that seeped through the metal. The wind shriek was a distant thing, a monster raging outside her sanctuary. The stone she had laid kept the frost from creeping up from the earth. Her home was a womb of warmth and quiet purpose in the heart of a howling apocalypse. She lit a second lantern, its golden light pushing back the oppressive grey that filtered through the few small, thick-paned windows she had installed high up the wall. She fed Ember a piece of salted meat and listened to his contented purr, a small engine of life running counter to the storm's destructive roar. Every hour, she would check the stovepipe, ensuring the wind had not damaged its seal, her movements economical and sure. She was not waiting out the storm, she was living within it, her preparations a quiet, unassailable answer to its rage. She was an island of foresight in an ocean of chaos, her round walls holding against the onslaught, proving their ancient, simple wisdom with every shrieking gust. The storm was not her enemy. It was her vindication. Down in the grid of prosperity, the world was breaking apart. The town's confidence, built on straight lines and 90-degree angles, shattered against the storm's elemental power. The wind, which had slipped harmlessly past Rowan's silo, found 1,000 purchases in the town. It hooked its claws under eaves, tore at shutters, and slammed into the flat, defiant faces of walls, seeking entry with the patience of a predator. The snow, driven by the gale, did not settle, it piled into monstrous drifts with supernatural speed, burying the neat, square world under a suffocating blanket of white. Mrs. Gable's fine, two-story house, with its many corners and decorative gables, became a trap. The wind howled through the attic, and a deep, groaning crack echoed through the home as a main support beam, stressed beyond its limits, fractured under the combined assault of wind and the rapidly accumulating weight of snow on the roof. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her customary composure. The family of Finn, the boy who had thrown stones, found themselves entombed. A drift, sculpted by the wind against the flat wall of their house, sealed their front door completely. They were prisoners in their own home, the cold seeping up through the floorboards, the firewood in the outdoor shed as inaccessible as if it were on the moon. Every corner was a weakness. Every straight line was a battlefront. The town's rigid design, meant to impose order, had instead created a landscape of vulnerabilities for the storm to exploit. Sheriff Thorne, a man of action, was rendered impotent. He fought his way from his office to the general store, a journey of 50 yards that took him nearly an hour, only to find its large plate glass windows shattered, the interior a maelstrom of snow and scattered goods. The community's central hub was gone. People were isolated in their freezing wooden boxes, their individual stores of food and fuel dwindling with terrifying speed. The very thing that defined them, their neat, orderly, interconnected grid, had become a network of isolation. The howling of the wind was no longer just a sound, it was the voice of their collective folly, a roaring judgment on their belief that strength lay in sharp angles and defiance rather than in graceful resilience. Their square world was failing, and they were freezing in the dark. Inside her warm, bright circle, Rowan felt a shift. It was a subtle change in the symphony of the storm, a new sound beneath the wind's ceaseless howl, a deeper, structural groaning carried from the direction of the town. It was the sound of things breaking. It was the sound of a world built on false assumptions giving way. She stood, her hand resting on the warm metal of the stovepipe, and closed her eyes. There was no triumph in her, no satisfaction in being right. There was only a quiet, solemn understanding of what must be done. Her sanctuary was not meant for her alone. Its strength was not a private victory, it was a responsibility. With the unthinking certainty of a migrating bird, she began to move. She banked the fire in the stove, ensuring it would burn low and steady for hours. She pulled on her heaviest coat, a patchwork of wool and leather she had stitched herself, and wrapped her face in a thick scarf. From a hook on the wall, she took down a long coil of heavy rope. She opened the silo's sturdy door a crack, and the storm tried to rip it from her grasp. She fought it, her whole body straining, and slipped out into the white chaos, pulling the door shut behind her. She tied one end of the rope securely to the door's iron handle and the other around her own waist. She was now anchored to the only solid point in a world that had dissolved into a roaring vortex of white. The silo was on a slight rise, and she used this to her advantage. Keeping the wind at her back and feeling the gentle downward slope of the land beneath her feet, she began to walk, a small, determined figure leaning into the maelstrom. It was a journey into pure abstraction, a blind faith in her memory of the town's layout. She could see nothing but the swirling snow a foot in front of her face. She navigated by instinct, by the feel of the ground, by the anchor of the rope that spooled out behind her, her only connection to safety. After what felt like an eternity, a faint, smudged light appeared in the whiteout. It was a lantern in the window of Sheriff Thorne's house. She had found them. She hammered on the door until a pale, shocked face appeared. Without wasting words, she led the sheriff and his family out into the storm, tying smaller ropes from their waists to her main line. They were the first link in a chain of survival. From there, they fought their way to the next house, and the next, a small, growing column of shivering, terrified souls, all tethered to the quiet girl and the rope that led back to the impossible safety of the round house on the hill. The contrast was so profound it induced a state of shock. To step from the shrieking, freezing chaos of the blizzard into the calm, radiant warmth of the silo was to be reborn into a different reality. The townspeople of Prosperity, their faces raw from the wind and their eyes wide with disbelief, huddled together on the stone floor, their bodies slowly unclenching from the brutal cold. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and baking bread, for Rowan had put a small loaf on the flat top of the stove. The sheer, stunning abundance of her preparation silenced them. The wall of firewood, stacked so high and deep, was a monument to a foresight they could not comprehend. The shelves, following the gentle curve of the wall, were laden with enough food to last a winter or three. They saw not the scavenged tins and weathered wood she had used, but the undeniable truth of her wisdom. They were alive because of the very folly they had scorned. Mrs. Gable, her fine dress torn and her hair matted with snow, sank to the floor near the stove. Her carefully constructed world of social standing and rigid propriety had been literally blown apart. She watched Rowan move through the huddled group, handing out tin cups of hot, sweet tea, her movement serene and efficient. The girl paused to check on her small orange cat, who was curled asleep on a blanket, and stroked his back. It was this simple, quiet act of tenderness that finally broke the proud woman's composure. Tears traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. She looked up at Rowan, her voice a raw, broken whisper that carried through the hushed space. "We called your home a folly." The words were a confession, heavy and sharp. "We stood in our square houses and we laughed at you." She choked on a sob, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors, all of whom were now witnesses. "We thought our walls were strong because they were straight. We were wrong. Our square walls were tombs. Her eyes came back to Rowan, filled with a terrible, humbling clarity. Your circle, it became an arc. She did not ask for forgiveness, the transgression felt too large for such a simple transaction. But her words hung in the warm air, a public dismantling of a lifetime of certainty, an act of profound surrender for the entire town to absorb. Finn, the boy who had once thrown stones, sat with his family, staring at the smooth, seamless wall he had once tried to dent with his casual cruelty. The wall had not even registered his assault. It had simply stood, patient and strong, waiting for him to need it. The great blizzard, which would forever be known in the region's lore as the White Reckoning, raged for 3 days and 3 nights. For 3 days, the entire population of Prosperity lived within the curved walls of the silo, a strange, humbled community forged in the heart of the storm. They shared Rowan's food, were warmed by her fire, and listened to the wind shrieking its impotent fury against the home they had ridiculed. When the storm finally broke, they emerged into a world transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of impossible, sculptural beauty and utter devastation. Their town was gone, buried under 20 feet of snow. The sharp lines and rigid angles were erased, softened into sweeping, organic curves. Only the tallest roofs were visible, and many of those were crushed. They were alive, but they were homeless. The rebuilding of Prosperity was a slow, deliberate process, and it was guided by a new philosophy. The memory of the silo, their ark, was burned into their collective consciousness. They did not rebuild their town as a grid. The new streets curved, following the natural contours of the land. The new buildings, constructed with timber salvaged from the wreckage, incorporated rounded corners and sloping roofs designed to shed the wind and snow, not to fight them. They learned from the circle. They learned that resilience was not about rigidity, but about the ability to yield, to adapt, to flow. Rowan was no longer the outcast on the hill. She became the quiet, unassuming heart of the new community. They did not try to thank her with grand gestures or empty words. They understood that her nature was too deep for such shallow things. Instead, they showed their gratitude with a profound and abiding respect. They brought her the first pick of milled lumber for her home, the finest glass for her windows, the best tools for her work. They sought her quiet counsel not on matters of society, but on matters of substance, the best place to build the new well, the signs of a coming frost, the proper way to stack wood to keep it dry. The silo itself became a landmark, a sacred place. Even after Rowan had built a small, sturdy cabin nearby, with curved walls, of course, the silo was maintained by the community, a silent monument to the storm that had destroyed their town and saved their souls. Years later, Sheriff Thorne, his hair now white, would often stand before it, explaining its significance to travelers. "We used to measure strength in sharp lines and square corners," he would say, his voice filled with a gentle reverence. "That girl, she taught us true strength lies in the grace of a curve." The story of the girl and her round house on the hill becomes a legend, a tale told on long winter nights when the wind howls and rattles the window panes, a story passed down not as a history of a blizzard, but as a parable about a different kind of sight. It is a story not of tin and wood and stone, but of the architecture of wisdom. And now, you who hear this tale, you who have followed her journey from ridicule to redemption, you must look at the world you have built around you. How many corners have you insisted upon? How many rigid walls have you erected in your own life, in your own heart, believing their sharp angles constituted strength, their unbending lines a sign of integrity? You build your days into square boxes, the 9 to 5, the weekly planner, the ledger book with its neat columns, the property line with its sharp, definitive corners, and you declare this fortress safe. You stand within your grid of certainty and you mock the dreamer, the one who follows the curve of the horizon, the arc of a wild idea, the meandering path of intuition. You call them impractical, aimless, a folly. You dismiss their circular logic, their refusal to be confined by the straight and narrow. But the wind is coming. For you, for all of us, the wind is always coming. A storm of change, of chance, of challenge you cannot predict or control. A whiteout of loss, a blizzard of uncertainty. And when it begins to howl, when it begins to tear at the structures you have so carefully built, will your corners hold? Or will they be the very points of stress where the entire edifice of your life begins to fracture and break? What circle have you built to shelter others when their own walls fail? What warmth have you stored against the coming cold, not of wood, but of kindness? What food have you gathered, not of grain, but of compassion? The strongest shapes, you see, have no corners for the wind to break, and the most resilient souls have no sharp edges for bitterness to catch hold. They are round, they are whole, and they are ready.